Hi, everybody. So just want to review a few things about the project you're working on. I'm sure you're all deep into your research. I hope that's going well. So as you know, the overview, which is all the data you're collecting, and the synthesis is all shared in your Adobe webpage. So if you want to remind yourself, refresh yourself on the layout, check out that sample wiki country on the United States. Okay, so you can see where everything would be located. So if you haven't checked out the how to write the overview document recently, I do suggest scanning through that as soon as you can, just to refresh yourself of the expectations. Some of the expectations are shared to save you time, okay? Especially the APA expectations and the exceptions, okay? If you can't find content. Now, the goal here is, no matter how you find the information, share it in any way you can. All right. It might say in the directions a graph or a pie chart, but if you find it in a different format, it doesn't matter, because the takeaway here is that you're sharing the data. Okay. So, and if you don't find data in a couple of different sites or at the Our World in Data site, just write that in your wiki. That way I know that you looked for it, and when one of your classmates looks at your web page, your wiki in week 7, they also know that it's just not, there's no data available. Okay, now regarding the synthesis. So the synthesis actually is looking at all of the data that you researched, and you're writing out two stories, two scenarios of how how the social determinants of health are all interconnected, and how they lead to health disparities in vulnerable populations. Okay, so there's 5 different headings for part 1. And so among the 2 stories that you're going to be writing, you're going to make sure you cover data from each of the 5. So for example, story number 1 might include data from the first 3 parts: intro, society, and culture. And maybe story number 2 includes education and housing. You can mix it up any way you want. I just want to make sure you know that the synthesis does not need to have data from all 5 headings, section headings, in both stories. Okay? That's important because it'll save you time. Okay? And so look at the data from the graphs, from your narratives, from the charts, right? Pick out 2 different vulnerable populations you want to write about, 1 for each story, and try to use unique data for each story. Sometimes there's overlap, but otherwise you can, it would be nice to have a variety of data. So for example, one story might focus on clean air or clean water, and then the other story might talk about living in slum housing. Okay, so you're talking about housing twice, which is fine to do, but I'm hoping that you refer to as much of the different data points as possible. Okay, so when you think of the data, right, you might find that there are no rights for LGBTQ individuals. You might want to focus on the rights. You might want to just suppose how easily they have access to education as a result of the stigma associated with identifying in that group, right? Is there any stigma of getting housing if you are living with the same-sex partner, right? Maybe there's no way to live with a same-sex partner, right? So what are some of the health disparities you might see in the LGBTQ population as a result of not getting housing? Maybe these individuals don't want to go to school because they're bullied all the time. So what is the long-term impact of these individuals if they don't receive an education? Okay. Some countries actually put people in jail if they are, if they identify as LGBTQ. Okay. So think about all of the data and how they all work together to lead to health disparities. Okay. And the health disparities would be specific. So you might mention mental health disorders, but I want you to bring that down a level. Anxiety, depression, risk for suicide, substance abuse usage. You might not have that data because mental health is in another part, but you can still write about a population struggling with mental health issues. Okay. What else? Think about the literacy rate. Think about girls and what is their literacy rate higher or lower than boys? Maybe you can make a story that goes alongside that. Looking at the introduction section, are there additional disparities you might see for people living in rural areas? There's countries that have a rainy season or countries that have droughts. And how is that going to impact vulnerable populations? Okay. Women are extremely vulnerable. And how will that impact them getting to school? And are they even allowed to go to school? Right? I know, we know Afghanistan and women have no rights. They are not allowed to go to school or hold jobs. So what is their future health look like? Okay, without an education or a way to support themselves. Can they live in a relationship that are they stuck in a unhealthy relationship because they know they can't support themselves because they were not allowed to go to school? So try to think of these different scenarios, okay, and make sure they're detailed. So whether you're sharing specific data, like the literacy rate is 82%, right? You can talk about the lack of sanitation, right? You don't have to say the percent that don't have it, but you can. All right. So detailed. You'll see in the synthesis document that this information would need to be specific and detailed. If it's broad, then I'm not really sure what the focus is on exactly. All right. And then the SDG targets. Which ones apply? Look at all 17 SDGs and which ones apply to your story, right? Is gender equality fit in? Does poverty fit in? What else do we have? There's housing, right? Access to transportation, although transportation is in another area, but you might talk about that in respect to somebody living in a rural area. So it's things like that to keep in mind. All right. That is generally the expectation. And also in the synthesis document, there's an order in which to share that information just because it makes sense. If you share it in a different order, it's hard to follow. So you don't want to start out by sharing SDGs because we don't really know what the story is yet. We don't know what is connected. And you also don't want to start out with health disparities because we don't really know what the data is for those social determinants of health. Okay. And of course, the first tip for success on the document is write all your overviews first because you can't write the synthesis unless you have data. Makes sense, right? And in the synthesis, the more succinct you write your narratives, the shorter they will be. If you write these broad statements that don't really share anything, like I shared some good examples in this document. Education is a major social determinant of health that affects health. That doesn't tell us anything, right? So share literacy rate of 87% and then continue your point, okay? And don't write about what's going well because that's not the point of this assignment. I can't stress that anymore. I've had synthesis where there's sentence after sentence after sentence about how things are going well. So that, not that you get points deducted about that. You can share it if you want to, but that's lost time. I don't deduct points for information that's not needed, but if there isn't information about what I am looking for, that's when points are deducted, okay? And make sure all of your points, all 4 parts of the synthesis are there, all right? Data, vulnerable population, specific health disparities, and the SDG targets, okay? So that's that. I'm here if you want to set up a time to talk with me, whether it's Zoom or phone. I'd be glad to go over that with you. Okay. So that's that. All right. You can do it. You can do it. Remember, this is probably the harder part of all 3 parts, because by part 2, you'll be all set to go because you've done all this preliminary figuring out. All right. Take care.